Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Valerie Niemeyer and Christopher Zehnder. Today we discuss Catholic social thought and economics. That means taking a long, hard look at capitalism as practiced and the dominance of corporations as dominating. We'll explore the nature of usury and what's at issue in a fair wage. We'll consider the state as a political community and the family as the cornerstone of social justice. We'll want to talk about personal responsibility as the foundation of the social order. Our welcome guests, and we have a number today, are Thomas Storck, the editor of Money, Markets, and Morals, this year from En Route Books, and its Australian contributors, Dr. Donald Boland and Dr. Garrick Small, as well as the American distributist thinkers John Médaille and David Cooney. Let's begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful, by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Since the panel is dealing with a panel, we'll try to do so in an orderly fashion. I'll begin, and I'll ask Thomas Storck, the editor of the volume in question, to answer the first question, but others can answer that in a different way. And then when we go to the second question, well, I'll ask Christopher Zehnder to ask that question. And anyone can join in, raise a hand. And when we come to the third question, I'll ask Valerie Niemeyer to ask that question. And if you think we have prepared questions, well, of course we have prepared questions. We'd run off the road within a minute if we didn't have prepared questions. However, the preparation is an ad libitum sort of thing. People are free to come and go and linger, and we don't countenance vaping, but if some people are going to insist on vaping, we'll allow for it. So I'll begin with the first question. And this is basic, and I think a whole lot of people don't ever consider it. Catholic social teaching, that's basic moral theology, isn't it?
Yes, it's moral theology as dealing with our interaction with others, especially when it comes to the economy. And you can define Catholic social teaching in a couple of ways. You can, and Pius XI in his first encyclical, Ubi Arcano, talked about it, and he gave a broad definition having to do with the whole question of Catholics and the state. But usually when we talk about it, we're dealing with the narrower question of the economy. And that's what the book is about, and that's what we usually mean when we say it. But the moral law does not cease to operate, obviously, when it becomes a matter of action by more than one person. It's not somehow merely an individualistic moral law. But as soon as we join with others or get into some kind of a combination, somehow the moral law ceases to have any validity. So that's why we can say, yes, Catholic social teaching is a part of moral theology as that regards our interactions, especially in the economy that we're talking about.
All right. Now, John, you weren't waving at Don. Welcome, Don. You weren't waving at him. You were putting up your hand to add to this question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add that in a way, social justice is a redundancy, because all justice deals with your relations with the world. And so all justice is social justice. the term wasn't introduced until 1841 by Father Tapparelli, and it was adopted in 1831. It adopted, 1841, adopted in 1931 by Pius XI, and he used it 9 times in his encyclical, and that's when it became part of Catholic social teaching. But we only needed a social justice because justice had been privatized, okay, by modern economics and by modern moral theories. So before that, the term wouldn't have made any sense at all, okay, before the modern era.
Well, but we have to remember that there are different kinds of justice. There's commutative justice, distributive justice, legal justice, and very often social justice is considered to be.
But social justice is just the application of those 3 kinds of justice to institutions.
Well, my understanding was that social justice is actually legal justice, or legal justice considered under a certain aspect or a portion of legal justice.
Well, I would also include distributive justice and certainly commutative justice in social justice, because both of those have social aspects. So certainly distributive justice, which is the just wage, is part of distributive justice.
Well, in Divina
Rerum, and exchanges is certainly has a social element. Yeah.
Well, in Divina Rerum Toris, Pius XI makes the distinction that the worker is due a living wage in commutative justice. And then he goes on to say, therefore, social justice, there's a duty to organize the economy and the institutions of the economy such that the payment of the commutative due wage is possible. So he's making the distinction there between the commutative justice due and then social justice, which makes possible the carrying out of the commutative justice.
At any rate, I believe that Tom and John would agree with me that we distinguish in order to unite. We distinguish in order to unite. And Christopher?
Yeah. Maybe it'd be good at this point, because I think any of those who might be listening to us are going to ask themselves, what do we mean by commutative justice and distributive justice? And even before we ask the question, I want to ask is how do we define capitalism? It's probably good to lay down those definitions, because I think the questions that when we address capitalism, we're going to have to bring in those distinctions again. So if someone would like to lay down those definitions, I think it'd be a good thing.
Well, I can take a start at it. Distributive justice is simply the distributions from a group to the members of a group. A commutative justice deals with exchanges between members of the group, and legal justice deals with what members of the group owe to the group. So the standard of justice for distributive justice is contribution and merit. So how much did you contribute to the group, and what is the merit of your contribution? Commutative justice deals with exchanges, and the rule of justice is that the exchanges should be equal. Whereas legal justice, the rule is what is necessary for good order and nothing more. So there's kind of a triangle. Distributive justice distributes to members of the group. Commutative justice is exchanges between members of the group, and legal justice is what the group members owe to the group.
Okay, so commutative justice would be more strictly mathematical. I mean,
arithmetic, yes.
Arithmetic, whereas distributive justice would be more proportional.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. And so it's not simply, even with distributive justice, it's not simply what does a person contribute to the group, which is part of it, but it's also what is owed to one simply in virtue of being a member of the group. So there are certain goods which are, yeah. Okay, I think that's important to understand, because again, like I said, when we're dealing with definitions like this, they're often very unclear to people who may be listening to us. Mm-hmm. And so that precedes the next point, unless someone wants to add to what we've said. But to proceed the next point, capitalism. What is capitalism? How do we define capitalism? I sometimes think capitalism is about as clear a term nowadays as socialism or fascism. Right? People use these terms, and oftentimes I find when I speak to people who say they're pro-capitalist, oftentimes they're not quite as they don't mean the same thing by capitalism as I would mean. So maybe we could invite anybody here to give a definition. What is capitalism? And I understand that there are various different ways of expressing it. I've seen that in various different writers as to what is its essence.
Yeah, there
we sort of clear that up.
Many different definitions, but I'd like to, if I may, I'd like to read one that I like to use. I think it's an authoritative one, namely from Pope Pius XI, from Quadragesimo Anno number 100. And he calls it that economic system in which were provided by different people capital and labor jointly needed for production. In other words, the keynote of capitalism, as Pius is saying here, is that you have one class that owns the means of production, and they hire other people to work for them. And there is necessarily a separation between ownership and work. And that's what I always mean by capitalism, although I realize that that's not what everybody means by it.
And I think you can add to that what John Paul II says is that it asserts the priority of capital over labor, and that capital is regarded as the chief contributor to production, when in fact there is no capital without labor. No.
Don, did I see you?
Hello. Has anybody read Chesterton's definition of capitalism?
That's it. Do we remember it? I'm sure we've read it, but do we remember it? I don't remember it.
I don't have it before me, but I think it's in his What's Wrong with the World book. And he defines it as that system where most of the property is owned by a few, and the majority by such necessity is required to work for money at the behest of those who have it. So he defines it in terms of property, that those that there is a few who own most of the property or control it, and the majority are required, because of their lack of property, generally, to work for hire. And that's fairly close to what Thomas said about it. But then he suggested that the name was inappropriate, because it suggested that most people were capitalists in a capitalist system. And he said, well, most people are not capitalists, they're proletarians. That is, they lack property generally, and most of them are in debt anyway. The time, most of their lives, paying off debt, so they hardly have any property to speak of. So he suggested the proper name for the system was proletarianism. I think that's a more accurate term.
Certainly more descriptive of the majority of people. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I would say it's the inevitable result of capitalism.
Now that's his term.
When you have one class controlling the means of production, the inevitable result is going to be that. Yes.
That's the point of his distributor.
Or I would say more that it is the inevitable result when, as capitalists did, you decide that economics is no longer subject to ethics, because then that's when it's going to happen. If that's been my contention for quite a long time, is that, capitalism could be done in a just way, or at least a more just way, if you could get capitalists to all agree that capitalism itself as a system is subject to ethics and the principles of ethics. Now, most of them will say, of course, you should act ethically, but they'll also argue that capitalism is a completely separate system.
Yeah, I just to add to that, that's a result of considering economics as a pure physical science.
Yes.
Which was 19th century. That was the achievement of the 19th century, to divorce economics and ethics, where before that, from the days of Aristotle until Adam Smith, you always had a political ethical economy, and this divorce of this pure scientism in economics creates this divorce. Well, ethics aren't an issue. It's just supply and demand charts. That's all. What do ethics have to do with that?
But I would disagree with you, David, to some extent, in that even if you got capitalists to agree to that, the tendency in capitalism, since you have a separation of ownership and work, the tendency is always toward regarding your labor as merely a cost item, and you want to reduce that cost as much as possible. So it's kind of working against nature. It's like saying, "Oh, we can put up pictures, centerfolds from Playboy, and just don't look at them. Just avoid your eyes."
Yeah, I do agree with you.
Easy.
I do agree with you there. As I said, ultimately it could be more just, but I don't think it would ever be a completely just system. You could make it better than it is, but I don't think it would resolve all the problems.
Well, as one person commented, it would be like, if you're going to compare it to Playboy, it'd be like reading Playboy with your wife turning the pages.
Well, I don't think that's very edifying. So, as a sometime logic teacher, sensitive to Christopher Zehnder's suggestion that we really work on definitions, let me first ask Dr. Small if he wants to get a word in edgewise here. Otherwise, I'm going to do a little bit of a riff from the logician side of things.
I'd like to broaden, I guess, the way we're looking at it. I think one of the contributions of Adam Smith, as much as he didn't make much by way of a positive contribution, was at least to map out the problem of distribution between the factors of production as land, labor, and capital. We often forget the limitations on what capital is when we're talking about what capitalism means. Capital is always some prior product, a tool. Land suffers from the problem of the understanding of property rights, which St. Thomas devoted quite a lot of attention to. And we often forget that when we're talking about questions of capitalism. If we look at the problem of distributive justice as the allocations between land, labor, and capital, if we begin with the observation that commutative justice is seldom practiced, which gives us some sort of an excess back to the factors of production, land, labor, and capital, it means there's always an excess, a residue. And so the capitalist would like to say, I will pay land as little as I can in order to run my business, and I'll take the rest. I'll pay labor as little as possible, and I'll take the rest. Marx, Proudhon and co. came along and said, no, we don't want that. We don't want the capitalist to take the excess. We're going to take it for the workers. And that hasn't worked out terribly well, as much as it was probably not a bad idea. The reality in our culture, pretty much through the modern era, is that we've lived in an era of absolute private property, which St. Thomas also had trouble with, and so did Aristotle. Absolute private property is an abomination. The capitalist thinks it's natural. Aristotle didn't, neither did St. Thomas. The socialists, proud and Marx and co, reject it in favour of Labor. So we've got this argument over private property that's in there. Henry George came along, and he wasn't a Catholic social theorist, but a lot of Catholics subscribe to his thinking, and he looks to Ricardo and said that land takes the residue, the excess. Capitalism is when the capitalist, the owner of capital, takes the excess. The problem with ethics is that ethics is always about self-restraint, whether it's you and your wife leering over Playboy or...
What? We're back to that.
Yeah, it's always about self-restraint. Self-restraint is when workers follow the advice of St. John the Baptist and give a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. Self-restraint is when the capitalist doesn't overcharge his clients, his customers, and doesn't underpay his factors of production, principally his workers. And self-restraint is also when the landowner is humble enough to realise that he should only get a return for what he actually puts in, rather than earning some speculative profit. And so we live in a world where we're just arguing over who takes the residue. The capitalist will say, I'll take the residue, thank you very much, because I'm so important to make all this happen. The labourer, following the socialist, says, I'll take the residue because I'm actually doing the work. And the landowner says, well, naturally, and with the foibles of human nature, I have it anyway, and you chaps can just go and argue to your heart's content, but I'm going to end up the wealthiest in the game.
Well, a lot of cards have been dealt in this discussion, and Dr. Small, you've certainly added a number of them. Let me go back, before we go back to Christopher, let me go back to the logician's riff, a little bit of a preamble to it. This past week in Trieste, the Holy Father said that democracy is not doing so well. And then he went on to speak of democracy. But what he actually did in speaking about democracy was to give a persuasive or perhaps aspirational definition of democracy. And logicians, even in informal logic, want to distinguish between definitions that are lexical. Those are definitions that report how a word is mostly used nowadays, lexical, and persuasive, how a definition is used to persuade somebody or other to have a certain view about that which is being defined. And then really the gold standard is a genus and species definition, which is as Aristotelian as we can get. And the idea there is we define something in terms of identifying the genus to which it belongs and what differentiates it from other members of that genus. Now, all of this is deeply complicated, and this is all of the riff as far as I'm concerned. Many people today don't think that there are any essences, so you can't give an essential definition. However, that's enough of that. So, Christopher, where should we continue?
Well, just to maybe wrap this one up, I remember Amintore Fanfani defined capitalism as an economic system which is where all goods are subordinated to material goods, to material good of profit. And so, or economic production, is what he said. So that he even said that the Soviet Union was the perfection of the capitalist order. And I thought that was interesting because what we're talking about, right, some of the things we're discussing is that when we talk about the relationship between the owner, the capitalist and his workers, we're not talking about something in itself which is perverse. There's nothing wrong for someone to own a business and to hire people to work for him. There's nothing wrong in markets, I would think, right? So what makes capitalism perverse is something else. It's the imbalance. Would it be right to say it's an imbalance, or is it like Matori Fanfani said, a false orientation, a false determination of what is the ultimate good of society?
Well, I think you have to distinguish. In the passage that I quoted, Pius XI goes on and says, the system in itself is not intrinsically wrong. And what he means by that is something David was getting at before when he said capitalism could, in theory, operate justly. But I would maintain that that it's nearly impossible for this to happen because of our fallen human nature. And so when we have power, we're apt to abuse that power. And when capitalists control the economy, they're apt to abuse that. And as I said, regard labor as simply a cost item to be reduced as much as possible, which is why I'm a distributist, because I'd like to eliminate that distinction between the owner and worker and make the owner worker and the worker owner. So that to me is it could operate, and on paper it could operate justly, but the examples of it are few and far between.
All right.
I think you can.
Valerie, why don't you push us forward here, because we're going to dwell on each of these questions at great length unless we have an external efficient cause come into play.
All right. Well, if there's something that just has to be said, you can add it into one of the later parts of our conversation. But I don't know who wants to take this, but the corporation, the advent of the corporation, I understand marked a major shift in what is economics. And so would somebody explain kind of what is the origin of the corporation? Why is there power? How does the corporation have power in a unique way? And is there a way to kind of confront or bring balance to that power that you know of? How can we contend with that? Is it
Well, I think
That might be Dr. Small's turf.
Well, the corporation is a legal entity, so its history comes from law, not from economics. And its origin, I believe, came from the early capitalist order, where the few were the lords of the land and of the realm, a sort of aristocracy who could own most of the property and would have what in the Middle Ages, of course, it was serfs who did the work, who were the labourers. That system changed in the modern era, but not basically because the workers, the serfs really were beginning to have a little bit of land of their own, which they could work on the manor, but they were gradually driven off those pieces of land and became property-less. Of course, the system of agriculture had changed, and there was quite a shift from the medieval system of distribution, which was imperfect, but it was beginning to have some beneficial effect in that the yeomen that were called, really it's a word that means workers of the land. The man of the land is a geoman. That's English becomes yeoman, and he was not an owner, but he had some rights to have his own property and land and live off that. And on top of that, there was a system of common lands that the poor could have access to eke out a better existence that way. But both those systems changed. The yeoman lost his strips of land when they were amalgamated into the lords, overall estate, and then the common lands were enclosed. There was a whole period when legal enclosure, which locked out the poor from that source of living, as it were. So the serfs were certainly servile, but they became more helpless with the change, and the shift then was connected with the advances in technology and manufacturing, and it became possible with new inventions to mass produce things, and that meant that the previous yeomen and poor had to go into urban areas, become factory workers, and make a wage. So that was the shift to the wage worker from the medieval system of serf. And in one way, it was a freeing of the worker. He was no longer tied to the land, but he had no tie at all except to the wage that he could make. And he became what eventually ended up in the late 19th century in Pope Leo XIII's description as in a condition little better than slavery, and the yoke of slavery. So he was politically free, but economically dependent, and in a way much more cruelly dependent than before, because there was no personal relationship between the worker and the employer as there was between the lord of the manor and his serfs. So they were sort of halfway between a family relationship and a slave relationship. But that sort of personal connection was lost, and the new system, the capitalist system, is very impersonal. The labourer competes with his other labourers for a price to work for the person who has the capital, and that can get very, very extremely oppressive at times, and it did in the 19th century, and that sparked the socialist revolution. Socialism didn't come before capitalism. It's a reaction to capitalism, and it's got the features of totalitarianism, which in a way are in the capitalist system already. That is a power, an excessive power over the majority to keep them down, as it were. And that's the description I think Chesterton gives. It's a technical definition. It's not a moral definition. It supposes a moral lack of justice, but it's not a it's an economic relationship in terms of property and labour, or capital and labour. Land comes into it indirectly insofar as you can't work or use your capital except on land. So the landowner has a certain control over what happens. But land and the old system, the medieval system, was land-based, really. It was the landlord, the lord of the land, who ran the show. That has become now, and the other thing that's missing is really what is in the title of the book, is money. Money is regarded as capital now. It's to do with the system of exchange. So that it's a complication in definition of capital. And I've dealt with the various aspects of it in my books.
Now,
And,
when you mentioned that magic word money,
Yeah.
I think of how I wish I had some money in the bank. And
Well, Jim,
basically to the closest bank right around the corner is something called the Bank of America. I don't know if there's a Bank of Australia, but there's a Bank of America. And once upon a time, my erstwhile quondam employer, instead of a bank there, because they weren't giving out much in the way of money, had a credit union. And I guess some people have some money in a credit union. And then we have a very active member of the American Solidarity Party, which you've all heard of, and I, of course, support, who helps to manage a public bank, a French fellow, John, Norm Chouinard. At any rate, maybe some of you folks could help us distinguish between the Bank of America, your friendly or more friendly, isn't it, credit union, and what we maybe wish there were a lot more of, public banks.
well, Jim, before we do that, would you mind if I said something in regard to Valerie's questions about the origin of corporations?
Yes, go ahead, please. We
Yeah.
can.
Well, I'll try to be brief. I can't speak to any other country, but in the United States, before roughly the Civil War, corporations were generally small things, chartered by state legislatures to do specific things. For example, operate a bridge or operate a steamboat between two ports. And they had a kind of a monopoly, but they were restricted both as to what they could do and as to how long your charter would last, which might or might not be renewed by the legislature. Starting with the 14th Amendment, which was designed to benefit the freed slaves, the corporations took a huge power grab, and they said that they were persons under the 14th Amendment, which eventually the Supreme Court recognized. And they achieved rights to perpetuity. Instead of being chartered for a certain number of years, they were forever. They achieved rights to do anything they wanted. Instead of just operate one particular thing, they achieved rights to own another corporation, like a holding company. And basically, they slowly, gradually achieved the prominence that they have in our economy today. But it's been a lot. In fact, that Citizens United case, which was in the last 20 years, was one of the latest power grabs on the part of corporations to have all the rights, but few of the liabilities of natural persons. So it was really, as Don said, it's a legal fact, not an economic fact. They manipulated the legal process, and so a corporation, if you do something wrong, you might go to prison. If a corporation does something wrong, well, probably at most it'll be fined, and they won't actually. The officers and directors won't actually go to prison. That's what it's a limited liability. I mean, it would have to be a very, very gross criminal act for them to actually go to jail.
So a corporation is essentially a collective group of people investing, and that none of them carry the liability or the risks individually. It's this kind of group holding, and they aren't responsible in the same way an individual is in terms of the law.
Right, and they're really
That's exactly the essence, is that the corporation divorces ownership and responsibility. So if you own property, if you own a car and it rams into somebody's house, you are liable for whatever the damages are. If the corporation and the owners of the corporation have no liability whatsoever beyond maybe losing the value of their shares. But they have no, so that's the whole meaning of limited liability corporations. So ownership, management, and use are all separated. And what this enables is the rise of a managerial class. Because the funny thing about capitalism is that, for the most part, most capitalists don't have very, very much power. The power is all in the hands of a professional managerial class. And so that's where the real elite comes from. is the managers of the property, not the owners. Most owners don't even know what the hell they own because they own it through a fund or something like that. Ownership,
Diversified investment
responsibility,
portfolio.
knowledge. Exactly. Yes.
I think you have to be
David, you
careful to factor into that analysis the proportions. Many people might own a microscopic share in a corporation, but in the concentration of wealth that's been happening over the same era means that there is a very small number, a very small percentage of the population that actually do have influence. And you're right, managerial class exercises apparent power and influence. But that concentration of wealth, I think, is key to understanding capitalism.
All right,
Natural consequence,
let's pivot back here, but we could bring the threads of the conversation into play. Should we maybe speculate that most bankers are almost as bankrupt as I am? Should we speculate that most bankers are wondering why they have to follow the orders they have from their managers? Let's take banks as a testing ground for what we've said so far about capitalism, about corporate ownership. Yeah, what about banks? They're on
Well, I would start off by because the bank versus credit union versus personal bank question segues right off the topic of corporation, because the banks are the corporations that have that managerial class that control everything, whereas, at least historically, credit unions were worker-based institutions within a particular industry or even within a particular company that they would collectively pool their economic resources and through that support each other. So I know there are other people in the panel who could certainly go more into depth and a better answer than I am. But to me, that's kind of the segue directly from the corporation question into the banks versus the other options question.
I think you're right. The banks are obviously they're financial institutions, but corporations are also primarily financial institutions. They're not really interested in the products they produce or the services they provide. They're interested in maximizing their shareholders' wealth, maximizing profit. That's purely finance. And one of the curiosities when you get closer and closer to finance is that in finance, you're not interested in production, in goods and serving human needs and all the other things economists talk about. You're interested in maximizing your financial returns, your profits. And so the banks do that. That's why Heinrich Pesch, the Jesuit, who was largely the inspiration for Prodigus Moano, defined capitalism as state-sponsored usury. And usury is really one of the key issues behind all of this.
Yeah, I think usury doesn't get nearly enough attention because finance is such a fundamental aspect of any production. All production is a process in time. There's always a gap between the planting and the harvest, between the raw material and the finished product. So all production has to be financed. That is going to give finance a key power in the system. But when finance gets more than it contributed, then you have usury, and usury gathers more and more wealth into fewer and fewer hands. Okay, and capitalism is always going to follow the course of usury. Okay, because the finance function is so critical to any production. Okay, any production, but it doesn't get nearly the attention. Either the economic attention or the moral attention, the political attention that it deserves. In fact, we don't even like to use the term usury today.
You know, one thing that most people don't realize is that the vast majority of our money supply is created by the private banking system.
95%, yeah.
Created as debt, which then is required to be paid back to the banks with interest, which interest is 100% usury. And it's people think of the money supply as the paper money that I have in my wallet, or maybe the gold Fort Knox or whatever. But no, that's just a minuscule part of their money supply. Most of the money supply is created by banks and created as debt. And probably this isn't a good time to go into this in detail how that works, but I've tried to explain it to people. Sometimes I found people have a hard time grasping that point.
Well, Henry Ford once said that if people understood the process of creating money, there would be a revolution before breakfast. He was wrong, because if you tell people how money is created, they won't revolt. They simply won't believe you. They can't believe that. They wouldn't believe that.
Or
such a system.
they'll join the process by buying some stock. Christopher, you were presenting us with a benign, ordinary sort of capitalism. Said surely there'd be nothing wrong with. I wonder, could we go back to the sort of image that you had in mind? Was there anything there that involved usury, or were you thinking of something that would not be usurious? Perhaps uxorious, but not usurious.
I wasn't actually thinking in terms of the finance aspect of that when we were discussing it. I think it though might be helpful. I know this is tedious of me, but it might be helpful if we defined usury, because again, those people who are going to be listening to us don't usually use the term, or they think usury is just excessive interest, but it's not just excessive interest. What is usury?
Well, it's any interest charged on a loan simply by virtue of its being a loan. And no matter what the purpose of the loan is for, whether it's for to buy a yacht or whether it's to start a business, if I charge somebody interest purely on the basis of that they're loaning me money, I'm loaning them money rather, then that's usury.
I think I have a little difficulty with that, because insofar as anybody contributes capital to some venture, they have a right to return on that capital that they create. So that's in itself not the problem. The problem is when they don't really contribute anything but a legal right. That is, the banks just create money. They do not lend out money. If I lend Thomas Storck, $1,000 to start a business, Thomas needs to pay me back the $1,000 and to let me participate in whatever the profits of that business are. But if I just invent the money, well, that's not the same thing, okay, as me taking money, having less money and you having more. So in that sense, all interest from a bank loan is certainly dubious. The bank is entitled to some return for the business of making the loan and the risk that you won't pay back, and things like the cost of servicing the loan, all of that, the bank is entitled to something.
Well, I agree with that. And I think the main issue there is the source of the return. Because like what you said, when you loan money to Thomas and you are entitled to a share of the profit. That's right. Mm-hmm. But the way we do our loans in our current capitalist society, that's not how it is.
Well, wait a minute.
The return you get is based off the money that was loaned to you. And it's an interest charge against money. So even if Thomas doesn't get any profit, you still do, because your return as the lender is not based on the success of the business. You don't have the same risk that he has. You're protected from risk because he owes you interest based on the money loaned. And that's really where the issue is in usury, by my understanding.
No, that's exactly what I was trying to say. So, John, if you owe me money for my business venture and you kind of buy a share in it, yes, you're entitled to a return on that. But on the other hand, if the business fails, which if I were running it, it probably would, then you would not get anything back. But as David said, simply because if the business fails and you still expect to get your money back, that's usury.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're just maybe saying the same thing in slightly different ways.
A useful way of understanding this, we're really coming close to including explicitly the element of risk. Most of the 20th century in the finance area has been devoted to justifying, explaining the risk-free element of an interest loan, of a money loan. And that
Although claiming that they're still taking a risk.
Well, the relative scale of the risk is negligible. If I borrow money from the bank to buy a house, they only see their risk starting when I'm not able to pay all my principal and accumulated interest back to them, which is a long way down the track, especially if the bank only lends me 50-80% of the value. They're very well protected. Whereas if I'm using that property for a business, a farm or whatever, the risk is really no proportion.
Let me interject this. Valerie, will you join me in asking these gentlemen, these worthy gentlemen, since we only have 3 minutes left, if they'd be willing to stay with us for another 15 minutes?
What do you think, gentlemen?
I'm available for as long as you're running this.
Yes, I can stay.
Well,
Valerie,
since it's Valerie asking, I'll stay. Yes.
yeah, that was
If Jim had asked, I wouldn't have done that. No.
all right. Way to go, Valerie.
I feel like you.
BNHO. Now, since we have an extension of 15 minutes, I don't think we'd want more, but since we have the 15 minutes, would you ask the next question?
You bet. So we hear a lot about wage issues, minimum wage, just wage, market wage. Help us make sense of, kind of these categories of and how they relate. A market wage, a just wage, and what was the third one that I just said? Fair wage.
Minimum wage.
Fair wage.
Well, that's what we get. That's what we get.
Okay, well, I think the best definition I've ever heard of a market wage, I have to give credit to Thomas because it's where I got it from, is that it's the lowest wage that they can get away with paying. That's the market wage. And what in my examination of that definition, I came to realize that the market that you're competing in isn't just your industry in your area or even your country. The market you're actually competing with is essentially the entire world. So if there's someplace else in the world, even in a communist country, that's offering a wage low enough that they can earn a greater profit, making it there and shipping it here, then that determines what the market wage is that you have to compete with. The minimum wage is an attempt at rectifying this that is noble but imperfect because it's usually implemented at a state level and it doesn't take into account the different costs of living in different areas, even within one state. You can establish a minimum wage that would leave a person destitute in a metropolis, but have them living in the lap of luxury in a more rural area. Whereas the church's teaching on a just wage really takes into account the locality of where you're living and says that a just wage is that if you were a person who is working full time, you should earn enough to be able to support your family. And
But
that's
David-
the basis of it.
David, if as long as you have mobility of capital, as you were saying yourself, you're competing against the whole world. If you pay workers in the rural area less than they do in the metropolitan, or vice versa, then that's an incentive for the corporation to move their production to the lower wage area.
which is not a bad thing.
Well,
If we got some more business and, move some from New York and Philadelphia out to Butte and Des Moines, that would not be such a bad thing.
Well, in my opinion, what it ends up doing is it incentivizes the corporations to place their business in the large metropolitan areas because the people are more dependent on them there.
Yeah,
And
there's
so-
actually
You go ahead.
there's actually an anomaly there that the cities should be the most efficient places to keep people. And so they should be the places where people are wealthiest. But that tends to be negated by the cost of real estate. It costs about the same to ship a can of beans to some rural town as it does to put it in the middle of New York. And it's more efficient to take a truckload of cans of beans to New York than, a handful to some little town. But the cost of rent, sort of no comparison. And that is an extra level of complexity that is often ignored, these sort of comparisons.
Yes, and I think it's ignored because land disappeared as a separate category in economics at the start of the 20th century. So there used to be land, labor, and capital, and that's how people thought about economics. In the 20th century, it was just capital and labor, and land disappeared into the capital fund, when of course that's nonsense. It has an entirely different mathematics. But I also want to point out, and I think it's very important, that low wages are just bad economics, because each firm's wage bill is every other firm's demand curve. Okay, so the wages that Thomas pays to Christopher is the money that Christopher can use to buy goods from David and John, So low wages necessitates government intervention into the economy because the government is forced to become the consumer of last resort. Okay, so the government has to buy battleships and welfare and big bureaucracies because nobody else has enough to absorb all the output. So low wages and big government sort of go together. Otherwise, the whole system collapses.
And Gary alluded a minute ago to Heinrich Pesch, the Jesuit economist, and he had a very, very interesting theory about wages, namely that since the labor of one person is generally, if he has the right tools and the right amount of land and so on, it's generally enough to support not only himself, but several other people. When a person is not paid that indicates some kind of a lack of balance, of mismanagement between those who control the payment and the actual worker, which is, again, one of the reasons that capitalism is a social evil, because you have levels of complexity that contribute to this. Whereas when you have a distributist economy or something approaching to that, then the levels of complexity are not there. And the relationship between the ability of a worker to generate income and the income that he receives is much, much clearer and much more direct.
So if y'all owned a company, or if there's probably listeners that own a small business. Like, how do they, what's your recommendation to them in terms of how to provide a just wage, considering all the complexities,
Well,
you have thoughts for them?
but yeah, in a way, yes. Pius XI was well aware, and he said that in a capitalist economy, employers were often in a bind because their competitors were not paying just wages. And if they wanted to compete with them, or even stay in business, not necessarily increase their market share, but just stay in business, they were in a real bind because their workers, they were trying to pay a just wage, and their workers, the other people weren't. This is in Divine Redemptoris. Now, Pius said that they have a duty, the employers have a duty in social justice to work to change the system so that, in fact, it is possible to pay the wage due in commutative justice. But unfortunately, at least in the United States, I can't speak anywhere else, business owners have absolutely no sense that they have any responsibility to ensure justice in the economy. At most, it would be a matter of a personal relationship with their employees. And in that case, when they do have the resources to pay a just wage, they're duty bound to do so, even if it cuts into their own profits, because the most they have a right to is, in a sense, a wage, and just like their employees.
Mm-hmm. But let me point out, I mean, that's the key issue, is that it's really not up to the individual employer for the most part. It's a systemic question, and that's why Quadragesimo Anno made it a systemic issue. So the employer doesn't always get to choose. Sometimes he does, but mostly he doesn't get to choose. And so systemic reform is required. And what are the systemic reforms? Well, they have to be aimed at balancing the power between employers and employees, because Adam Smith pointed out that wages are a result of power negotiations. And so long as one side has all the power, there will not be just wages. So things that help to increase the power of labor are things like labor unions, guilds, minimum wages, imperfect as they are. All of these things increase the bargaining power of labor, and where the power between both sides is more or less equal, probably the result will be a just wage. But as long as there's an imbalance of power, there can never be a just wage.
Now, getting back to the American Solidarity Party, which I know you're all secretly thinking about and wish I'd discuss more openly. I have a yard sign, a beautiful yard sign that says Satsky Onak, American Solidarity Party, pro-life, pro-family, and pro-worker. We've talked some about workers. We haven't spoken directly about life. We should at least speak about the family. We want to say in Catholic social thought that the family is the core unit of society. And John Paul II, I don't know if anybody before him, but John Paul II definitely spoke of the need for family politics. We don't have much time left, and I wanted to get that in. So whoever wants to comment, please do.
Yeah, so I think you make a good point. We really live in two economies, is one way of looking at it. That someone sort of goes down to breakfast, a schoolboy. He doesn't lay his Visa card on the dining room table to get breakfast. His parents give it to him, and as a result, he gives them a lot of things in return. There's a gift economy that is core in the family, and there's a notion of justice and purpose and proportionality. You go outside the front door, and you're living in a contract economy where it's a taking economy. It's not a giving economy. One of the curiosities of the early social encyclicals, not so evident in the later ones, was that the answer, you go to the back of Rerum Novarum, and you might be looking for economic policy advice or something. It's evangelization. The same thing at the end of Quadragesimo Anno. And there's almost an irony that on one hand, what we call Catholic social thought is really an outline of how creation works, how human nature is meant to work socially. But the irony is that in order to achieve it, you need the players, especially those with power, whether they've got union power or money power or whatever it is, those in power to choose the good rather than self-interest. And most of the capitalist era, the last 500 years roughly, has been an attempt to justify greed as a virtue. And we see this all the way through. Greed is good. Probably the most recent kind of example of it. And when Mason Gaffney wrote about the corruption of economics, especially focusing on the development of American economic thought, it had this chorus that the people that were funding the economics professors were the people that had grown rich on capitalism. So it provided a kind of form of moral justification, whereas the alternative is to put God first. And that's very awkward because in our era, the Protestant ethic, which really was the genesis of capitalism, gave us the first idea that we get to define our own moral order, whereas humans have to exist within the reality. And that's what Catholic social thought really attempts to expose. What is the reality, or what is the necessity that we're working amongst?
A profound realization. I wonder.
Just to add to that, I mean, the use economy and the exchange economy, and the use economy is almost always a gift economy, almost by necessity. But when we saw this big transition of women from the home sphere to the work sphere, so we saw this huge increase in GDP. Okay. But it wasn't real because the only thing that was happening was that so-called women's work, if I may put it that way, was being monetized. So when mama cooks meals for the family, GDP doesn't change. But when mama takes the family out to McDonald's, okay, GDP goes up. But there was no real increase in output. It was the same number of meals, whether mama did it or the fry cook at McDonald's did it. So, and that's, we had this huge increase in GDP, but no real increase in output. So our way of measuring the economy through GDP itself is corrupt because it only measures the exchange economy. It doesn't even recognize the existence of the use economy.
And this isn't even really an issue of women having economic earning potential, because in the past, there used to be home industries that wives and mothers could participate in and actually earn income for the family while simultaneously taking care of the home. Mm-hmm. And capitalism came in and used its economic power to change legislation to illegalize a lot of those home businesses and basically say, well, you can produce cloth for your home, but you can't sell it. And that is basically took away a significant economic source for families in the past and drove women out of the home into the factories, making the same cloth that they used to make at home, although cheaper because it was industrialized. And that is another aspect. And this is really just a whole shift of the notion of how economy fits into home management, which is actually the root meaning of the term. You know, economy used to be, how you manage the financial needs of the home. And it has now become, how we manage the financial success of the nation, and how we define success has changed to simply mean how much we produce and how much people how much corporations profit from it.
I think that's illustrated in history too, that the end of the 15th century, the average worker in England was producing something like 3.5 times his sort of needs, his consumption needs. You move forward into through the 16th century. By the time you get to the end of it, the average worker in England was actually producing less than his income needs, and the standard of living was going down. And that was happening all through the maturation of mercantile, then industrial capitalism. The GDP was increasing, but the standard of living for the vast majority of the population, you see this especially in England, was actually falling to the point where, my country was populated by convicts and their warders, because the Englishmen and Irishmen and Scotsmen couldn't afford to feed their families. And you had the most economically successful country on earth, well, maybe apart from the United States, but through the era of the British Empire, the great majority of the people were living in abject poverty. It was absurd. That's the problem of the modern misuse of private industry, private property.
But GDP was going up, so it's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Gentlemen,
The economy is strong.
we've come to the end of our extra time, and I know that you will all be invited back, and I know that you all have a lot more to say, but that'll require a whole other episode. And since we've had 285 episodes already on the Open Door, you know that we're a very episodic enterprise and that we will be inviting you back. But now it's time to end, and we end whatever we speak about.
Well, did you see the message that Sebastian just sent? He said, plug the book. So we should mention the book.
Could you repeat that again? I'm not going to be distracted by that fellow, but go ahead, repeat it again.
Sebastian sent a little chat, I guess you call it, saying, plug the book. So maybe we should just mention it at least. John's holding it up there.
Okay.
Money markets.
That's the book. Listen, listen, I don't think that Sebastian is motivated by capitalism. I think he's motivated by a true love for the common good. And then, all right, mark it away, dude, mark it away.
The money market
on that enterprising
Morals.
note, in passing over in silence that among many master's degrees that Sebastian has, he's about to add one in marketing. We're going to end with the scripture for the day. And actually, in honor of Australia, we're ending with the gospel for tomorrow. It's the feast of Saint Benedict, who certainly had an economics in practice, and as an economics that greatly affected the whole of church life and greatly benefited the family. So the reading for the gospel for tomorrow is from Matthew. Jesus said to his apostles, "As you go, make this proclamation. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, drive out demons. Without cost, you have received. Without cost, you are to give. Do not take gold or silver or copper for your belts. No sack for the journey or a second or sandals or a stick. The laborer deserves his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, look for a worthy person in it. Stay there until you leave. As you enter a house, wish your peace. The house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. If not, peace return to you. Whoever will not receive you or listen to your words, go outside that house or town and shake the dust from your feet. amen, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thanks so much. Dr. Boland, you didn't get your last words in.
Yeah.
You'll have to have the first words on our next episode since you didn't get your last words in on this one.
I just asked everybody to read question 77 of the second part of the Summa.
That's a sibilant suggestion.
Yeah. 78 is on usury.
All right. Now there is this item in Aquinas where he says you can't buy what doesn't exist. And when I read that, I thought about the commodity exchange market and buying futures on soybeans. Soybeans don't exist.
77 explains all about money making.
All right.
Okay.
Take a note. I'm going to look it up.
All right.
Thank you all.
Godspeed,
Thanks.
Godspeed, good friends.